Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, boa madrugada, onde você estiver. Eu sou o Thiago Luiz Chiquete. Sejam bem-vindos ao canal Desvendando Mistérios. Ele investigou o caso Heber, onde um OVNI pousou numa base aérea militar e um dos militares chegou a tocar no objeto. Foi também um dos melhores amigos do pesquisador Bud Hopkins sobre abduções alienígenas. E também é um dos maiores ufólogos do mundo. Hoje eu tenho o prazer de trazer para vocês um entrevistado muito mais do que especial. Peter Robbins, autor, escritor, ufólogo há mais de 30 anos. Pesquisou o caso da floresta Heber, Bentwaters, Woodbridge, aquele caso onde um objeto voador não identificado pousou numa base militar norte-americana na Inglaterra, lá no início da década de 80. Peter também foi grande amigo de Bud Hopkins, um pesquisador que investigou e analisou centenas de casos de abduções extraterrestres. Nesta entrevista inédita e exclusiva, Peter vai trazer coisas que só ele sabia, mas agora vai compartilhar conosco. Então, se preparem para essa incrível entrevista com Peter Robbins. Mas antes de dar o início, não se esqueça, se inscreva no canal. Marque também o sininho, que é o lembrete, para sempre que tiver um vídeo novo, por exemplo, uma entrevista nova, inédita e exclusiva, você ser avisado. Não deixe também de dar o like em todos os vídeos do canal. E por fim, deixe a sua opinião nos comentários. Vamos então para essa entrevista com o pesquisador norte-americano Peter Robbins. Hi, Peter. Thank you very much for being here in my show, and I hope I'm sure that Brazilian audience is gonna love it because they will know you much better. I know that was here in Brazil in Foz do Iguaçu. I think was 2013 or 2014 or 2015. I don't remember, but it was the year that we met. So Thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
It is my pleasure to be here with you, Thiago.
That's great, my friend. Well, I will start with the same questions that I make to all my guests. What led you to the ufology?
Growing up in a simpler time in America, this was not an interest of mine. I love to read. I collected rocks and bugs and fossils, and I collected stamps, which I found very exciting. Again, a much simpler time. A little piece of paper that had been to China or India or England or these exotic places I had only read about. But UFOs, flying saucers, it only interested me in the science fiction. You know, the movies I would go to at the local movie theater as a boy and watch the space monsters, you know, kill the human beings and the human beings kill the space monsters and all that good stuff. But I guess you could say, I intuited from the adult world that this was not a serious subject, so I just didn't give it thought. Then things changed when I was a boy and playing outside of the house I grew up in, which was in a little village about 30 miles east of Manhattan. So I had the best of both worlds. I was kind of in the countryside, but in less than an hour, I could be in New York City, and I loved growing up like that. Anyway, my sister Helen and I were playing in the front of the house, and it was a late morning, blue sky, nobody around, no children playing, no cars going by. Sometimes that is the way it is in a small village. And I caught something in my vision, and I called my sister's attention to it, and we watched as 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects in a V formation, you know, 1 and then 2 and 2, came in very fast and stopped over the home of the people across the street. And I was shocked. From then on, we did not say a word, but we looked. And they were there for me, I think, for minutes. That is a very long time. So my first reaction was something, as a professional in the field, I have documented many times with witnesses to sightings. Your logical mind goes through everything they cannot be, or that they're not. They were not airplanes, they were not helicopters, blimps, dirigibles, balloons, strange-shaped clouds, reflections from the ground, floating plastic bags. They were none of these things. And my last thought, trying to hold on to something, was maybe there's some kind of secret government aircraft. But they were round. I mean, elliptical, like holding a dinner plate at a distance and tipping it slightly. And both Helen and I could see around the edge of each little regular spaces that many years later, when we finally talked about it, we could only read like windows on an airliner. And that was about it for me. I remember at that point thinking, feeling like a cosmic loneliness. I don't know how else to say it, Thiago, that everything I thought I knew, everything the adult world had taught me, everything I had learned in school, growing up as a Jewish person, that I learned in religious training, everything was now open to question. And I didn't like it. I was very uncomfortable with it. And I went to run into the house to tell our mother. And then, to compress the story, I either passed out or was knocked out. I went unconscious. And when I woke up, my sister was not there. I had skinned my arm as I fell. And I went into the house, and my intuition said, go upstairs. And I walked upstairs, knowing my sister's bedroom was at the top of the stairs. And I saw her. Even before I got fully up the stairs, she was looking out her back window into the backyard. So I just saw her back, but private moment. Then I went into the kitchen to tell our mother what we had seen. And she did not, what she did was very good. Even though she didn't remember it when we talked about this years later, she was making lunch for us at the stove. And she looked at me, and I remember thinking, this is the way adults look at each other. This is the way grown-ups look at each other, and didn't feel she had to say something. I was not a liar. I was a very bad liar as a kid. That day, I went to the library. I got some books on UFOs. I didn't like any of them. They were all about people who had been on flying saucers and gone on rides to the moon and Mars and things. I returned them. And then I managed over the next weeks to put it out of my mind. It became my repressed memory from childhood, although I sometimes joke with people that if I have other repressed memories, I don't remember them. But that is how it started, Thiago. And then years passed without my thinking about it, except once, in a very distorted way, the very first time I took LSD in the 1960s. The memory came through, but then I convinced myself after that it was just an effect of the drug. 14 years plus passed, and then that memory came back. It came back like a freight train. It just roared into my head, and I kept seeing it over and over, and I thought I must be going crazy. But I remembered, of course, I had a witness. I phoned my sister. I was very careful not to just blurt it all out. But I told her I needed to know if she remembered something I remembered from childhood. And I began to set the scene, tell her about the weather that morning, where we were standing, about the time of year. And she just cut me off and said, stop, I know what you're talking about. And then told me essentially what I remembered, which felt very good and very bad. They're real. They're real. But then she said what changed my life. She said, but there's more. And she began to describe to me conscious memories that she had simply never forgotten, but never talked about, of being on board a craft and being taken up from the ground. And I had never heard of anything like this before. But that day, I became obsessed with the subject. I had to know what happened to my sister. I had to know what these things were, what they were about. And I was starting to live my dream career. I was a painter in New York City, and that was all I wanted to do. But I knew that something more important had come up for me. And you know what? I resented it. I was angry because I could never devote myself to the arts again to that degree. And I just kept doing it. And here I am all these years later talking to you about it on your show. That is how I got interested.
I didn't know about that. And so you were abducted, do you think?
No, she was.
She was.
Yeah.
Because and it's curious because you was in the grass in a yard, and she was upstairs in a room.
Yeah. Well, what happened was it had all taken place while I was unconscious. If you would have driven by the house, you wouldn't have seen me. I was down on the ground. And it was a quiet late morning. My mother was in the house. She didn't come out. Helen was apparently taken once I went down. And she remembered going up in the air and seeing me get smaller and smaller, and seeing the top of the house get smaller and smaller, and seeing them get bigger and bigger. And the next thing she knew, she is in them with the grays. For your viewers, rather than my going on and on about this, early this year, Richard Dolan, the well-known ufologist, he was very interested in this story. And he wanted to do a deep interview. And he moved in for a few days, and we recorded hours of this. And then I gave him all of family photographs and, all of Helen's drawings and things, and he put it together. And you can all see this by going on YouTube to the Richard Dolan Show. And then you're looking for, I think it says 1961 abduction, Helen Wheels. That was her professional performing name as a singer. Wheels like on a truck, Helen Wheels. And it's about a 70 or 80 minute interview, fully illustrated, that goes into much more detail than I can now. But yes, I was knocked out. She was taken, which over the years that I worked with Bud Hopkins as his assistant, I learned repeatedly, this is not uncommon. They are interested in sometimes one person in a family, in a generation, but not the next one. A husband can be knocked out, the wife is taken. One sibling can't wake up, the other one is gone, that kind of thing.
And also we spoke about Bud Hopkins. For me, is the greatest researcher of abduction phenomena. You were one of his best friends. And tell us, and his assistant, like I said, tell us how was this experience to be side by side and seeing he working?
Well, for somebody like you or me, who has a profound interest in this subject, it was life-changing in the best sense. We both became interested in this subject, seriously interested, at about the same time. And almost a year into my obsession, I was walking by a newsstand in Manhattan, and I saw a headline on one of the weekly newspapers. I think the title of the article was "Sane Man Sees UFO." And I bought the newspaper and I went home and I read it. And it was the best research thing I had read since I had started. But the New York art world is very small if you're in it. And I knew there was a painter named Bud Hopkins, and I wondered if this could be the same person. And in those days, you had a big phone book. And I opened the New York Manhattan phone book, and there was one Bud Hopkins, and he spelled his name Budd. And I just called him up and I introduced myself as a fellow painter, that I was on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts, where I had graduated from and was then a faculty member teaching painting, and that my sister and I had had a very real sighting when we were kids, and she seems to have been taken. And the very first thing he asked me, Thiago, was, "Tell me about your art." Well, I did, and he was not impressed. Bud was what we would have called a late period abstract expressionist. I was coming out of the 1970s minimal art movement, conceptual art movement, but he was interested enough in Helen's experience to invite me over for coffee. And so I went to his home on West 16th Street, and we sat in his kitchen at his kitchen table, and I thought, this is very interesting. Another painter who is interested in UFOs. This is 5 years before he publishes his first book. He's just getting into it like I am. And we became friendly acquaintances, and then we became friends. And then in 1981, he publishes Missing Time, which, as you know, is one of the most important early contributions to abduction research. Brilliant book. And all of a sudden, he is famous in the UFO world as well as the painting world. And we began to spend more time together. Then I started to do some work for him in his art studio and also answering letters from people who had had UFO experiences. Then in 1987, his best known book, Intruders, is published. And all of a sudden, he's getting thousands of letters, and everybody wants him on the television show and to speak at their conferences. And then I began to work for him more or less full-time, part-time. And we were good friends for 35 years. And for almost half that time, I worked as his assistant. Bud was the best self-trained investigator and like detective I ever knew. He had such a great mind, and he was very much a humanist. He was, of course, very driven by his curiosity about why these particular other intelligences were taking people. But he was equally concerned about the people who were being traumatized in these experiences. As you and I know, many people have very positive experiences, but many others do not. And the ones who did not started to seek him out more and more. I think some people think that was what he looked for these people. These were the only ones he wanted to talk to. These were the ones who needed him. And I was by his side through probably 200 investigations, and he probably worked with 800 people in his life. I know this because he kept very careful records. This is all pre-computer, really. And so it was all writing it in ledgers. And when he started after he had trained to do hypnotic regression, everything was audio recorded, and every audio cassette was put into a special file and notes made on it in ledgers in terms of how many times they had seen him, the subjects that came up, this kind of thing. I learned more from him about how to do this work, about how to be with people. I love people, most people, many people, but I also am very empathetic and a humanist. And at this point, frankly, as interested as I am still in them and who they are, why they're here, how many of the thems come and go, I am actually more interested in the impact on people. Because, as you know, if enough people in the world would take this seriously, the world would change. We would begin to think of ourselves first as human beings, not first as Brazilians or Americans or Chileans or Indians or Canadians or Germans or whatever, or men or women, or Christians or Muslims or Jews or Buddhists or whatever. The potential for a serious acceptance of these other intelligences coming and going could bring all of humanity together in a way we have never experienced. And I think that frightens world governments, because nationalism is so important to keeping you loyal to your state, and to see other people as the other and threats to you. In some cases, of course, this is true, but it is also easier to manipulate us.
Many people criticize Bud Hopkins because he doesn't have the professional knowledge to make a hypnosis regression, something like that.
That's right.
What do you think about this argument that the skeptics always say?
I'm very glad you asked that question. I am, at this point in my life, after more than 40 years in this work, generally regarded with some respect by most people who are aware of who I am. What are my qualifications in this work? I have a BFA, a Bachelor of Fine Arts, with a major in painting and a minor in film history. So how does this qualify me as a ufologist? Well, there is no special qualification. You could have 4 PhDs and still not be very good at this if your temperament, if your reasons for doing the work are, your motivations are, self-centered rather than in terms of acquiring knowledge for humanity. It's great to have a background in psychology or chemistry or astronomy or so many subjects that make sense. But one thing about being trained to be an artist, and Bud certainly was, and I certainly was, is that you come at problems and challenges in very untraditional ways. Your thinking is non-standard in many cases, and you can sometimes come up with a creative approach to something that actually gets results, where a more staid academic approach does not. You look at people like Kathleen Martin, certainly one of the acknowledged world leaders on the abduction subject. She has a background in psychology and social work. Perfect. Also, she is the niece of Betty and Barney, so she grew up with this subject. Stanton Friedman, who we loved and a major contributor to the field, he's a retired nuclear physicist. Very good. People respect that. But knowing nuclear physics does not necessarily give you a qualification to be a good UFO researcher. Being somebody with an inquiring mind and a great intellect and an ability to allow your mind to change, which is very important. You and I have met many people who they have a stand, they have a theory, they have something that people know them for, that they feel important about. And the last thing they're interested in is having their mind changed, even if information, evidence comes to them that is substantial and should let them open their mind and say, you know what, I am rethinking what I, had before. But to criticize somebody because their background is non-traditional, ufology is a very unregulated area. In America, we have something called the American Medical Association. If you are a physician and you practice and you screw up, or you fake records, or you lie about a patient's history, you can lose your license to practice medicine. If you are an attorney, we have something in America called the American Bar Association. I'm sure these same things exist in the equivalent in Brazil, where if you're an attorney and you are caught lying or faking evidence or something, you will lose your license to be a lawyer. We have nothing like that in ufology. If you're a member of MUFON, Mutual UFO Organization, a UFO group, the largest UFO organization in the world, they train you to be an investigator. and I guess they could they could throw you out of the organization. But there are only really a few thousand people in MUFON, and many thousands of people who, I am a UFO investigator. Well, what are your qualifications? Well, I say I am one. That's why I am one. And what are you going to do about it? I think so much so much of the importance is on your honesty, your integrity, your ability to do honest research, to keep an open mind, to never treat people like you're just a case. You're a bug that I'm examining with a magnifying glass. To always remember that the witnesses come first. People who have had experiences, and especially abduction experiences, should be worthy of our respect and consideration. And for many people, oh, I don't know about this abduction thing. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. You could just say this. Well, very few people that I have encountered in my professional life would lie about this. Why? So people will make fun of them, or that they will feel important or special? That is not very common.
And Peter, what's your opinion? What's your opinion about the extraterrestrial abductions? What do you have any theory to explain it?
Yes, but even after more than 40 years, Thiago, I know that anything I say here is just my opinion and my theories based on a great deal of study, a great deal of time spent with these people who allege they have had these experiences, my critical thinking, deductive reasoning, common sense, and a certain amount of very real, very physical evidence. So, why might they? And again, I think there are different theys who come and go, whether they're extraterrestrial, interdimensional, I don't know. I think they probably both exist and more. But why do this? Well, let's try to find a human model. Let us say that you and I did not go into this work, but we became biologists, and we were very interested in a certain kind of mammal. You know, the otter, the animal, the otter, is that translate well, is like a small seal, very playful animal. Does that ring a bell? Well, whatever.
It's here. Here we call the peixe boi.
Okay. Let's say that this was our specialty. We researched these animals, and we learned that somewhere in the north of Canada, there was a special kind of otter that is now endangered, and we have to find out why they are dying off and the population is shrinking. Remote area. So they take you and me and they fly us in helicopter, and they land us with 2 weeks worth of food and all our scientific instruments in a tent, and, you know, a little stove and all that stuff, and a bunch of traps to trap them. So we set our traps just to catch them, not to harm them. And the next day we go out and we got one. Now, we can imagine this otter is pretty freaked out. All of a sudden it is not free. It's caught in a little metal container. And I pick it up and I'm petting it and I'm saying, don't worry, we won't hurt you. We love you. We just want to help you. Meanwhile, you give it an injection and then put maybe some drops in its eyes. And I spray paint a number on its side, and you put a collar on it with the radio, and we let it go. Well, this otter is pretty upset and goes back to the other otters, says, you're never going to believe what happened to me. Maybe they have their reasons for monitoring certain human beings. And one of the things we have learned is overwhelmingly, they are following bloodlines. If it happened to you, it probably happened to one of your parents. And if it happened to you, it may well happen to one of your children. Why are they doing this? Well, maybe they are concerned about us and how the increasing environmental changes and the poisons are hurting our bioenergetic systems. Maybe we are a laboratory experiment on a certain level going back hundreds of thousands of years. Now, in laboratories around the world, we can splice genes. We can make changes in the way that living things evolve. And that's us now. Maybe they have been doing this for 50,000 years, 500,000 years, a million years. And let's say when Neanderthal man was around and they came down, they said, we want to speed up this evolution and see how this thing goes and see how these creatures evolve. So let's do a little gene splicing here. And what we have Cro-Magnon man now, a couple of 100,000 years ago. And maybe they just continue to tweak to do it. Maybe we are, again, somebody's experiment. Or maybe they realize more than we do that in a relatively short time, at the rate that the Earth, with climate change, global warming, increasing toxins in the oceans, that 100, 200 years from now, a lot of time for us, no time in the great spectrum of things, humanity is going to be in a lot of trouble more than we are now. And that this whole idea of hybrids, of creating a being that is part us, part them, maybe part of an effort to create a being that has the best aspects of both them and us, that has more potential to survive. Again, we are almost only limited by our imagination in why this is happening. Is it good or is it bad? Well, number one, for them, these words don't apply. They're doing these things like we do things to animals in laboratories. We experiment on them to help us. We try different medical procedures on them to help us when we need a similar procedure in the future. But we treat them okay, but they are little hard slaves. They are there probably very frightened, and we are doing things to them that cause them pain and fear, but we're not doing it because we're good or bad. We're just doing it because we're scientists and we are learning from them. So maybe some of them are good, which I hope so. Maybe some of them are bad in our point of view. I hope not. But whatever they're doing, they have a reason. And it has nothing to do with our logic or our ideas, except the ones I'm talking about here, which I think most people can accept as possibilities, because we do it to lesser creatures the way they are doing it, seemingly, to us.
I cannot agree more. Sometimes I say, well, we are lab rats. And no, you're so cruel. No, I'm not. I'm just show you the facts. That's the facts. Let's change the subject, my friend, about the Rendlesham Forest UFO case. What led you to investigate this case that happened in 1980 in England?
Yeah. As some of your viewers know, the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident, it used to be called the Bentwaters incident because the name of the NATO base where the American presence was in that part of England, in the southeast part of England, in the area called Suffolk, East Anglia, it occurred there. But the Rendlesham Forest was the site and areas around the forest of what has become known as the very best known UFO incident in the history of the United Kingdom, and in particular in England. It happened over the course of several nights in late December of 1980, and a number of witnesses were involved. Some of them were civilians, but the key witnesses were all United States Air Force personnel. Although it happened in 1980, the story did not become public for several years. And that was in October of 1983, when the big British tabloid, the News of the World, broke the story. I still think in a very sensationalized way, but all of a sudden it was public knowledge. And that is how I found out, as well as many people in the field, because all of a sudden it's being published in that paper and then other papers. But I was working with Bud. I was interested in other things, and it was a case, and an important one. Anyway, in 1987, there was a very important conference in Washington, D.C., UFO conference marking the 40th anniversary of Roswell and the modern age of UFOs. And I went there. I was part of a panel discussion that was chaired by Dr. David Jacobs, another abduction researcher. And I was there on that panel with some famous abductees, including Whitley Strieber and Deb White Cabell, who is a subject of Bud Hopkins' book Missing Time, and some others. I was there as a research specialist who happened to grow up with a sister who had this happen. There was one speaker there named Larry Warren. He alleged that he was a witness to things that happened in the Rendlesham Forest when he was in the Air Force on the third night of these events, and spoke with great passion. And I was very interested in his account. And we met the next day, in the hallway and chatted briefly. And I told him I wanted to do an interview with him. And we arranged for him to come to New York City the very next weekend. And he slept on my couch, and we sat there, and I asked him a lot of questions through the weekend. And he came off to me very credible, very sincere, and brought with him some of his Air Force paperwork. And at the end of the weekend said he wanted to write a book about what had happened to him, but that he was not a writer, and that he was looking for somebody to co-author the book, and was I interested? And after setting up his terms, I thought, number one, I was interested at that point in starting to write a book. I had been working in the field for 12 years. I'd written articles, spoken at conferences, although still probably best known as the assistant to Bud Hopkins. And I thought, why not? And so he started to come to the city, and I would continue to interview him. There were a few times, Thiago, that I thought, something is a little off here, or that he has had I give you an example. He came in one week and he had glasses, and they're very nice looking glasses. And I told him I liked the frames. And at one point he disappeared. He was in the bathroom, and I picked the glasses up and I put them on. And they were just glass. There was no prescription, they were just glass. And that's okay. Some people like wearing glasses because they think they make them look better or whatever. And he came out, and I told him I had tried the glasses on, and, they were not prescription. And he got very angry, and he snatched them from me, and he insisted that they were. And I thought, okay, I've embarrassed him, but they're not prescription. But thinking back on it, it was like he lied about that, and I just let it go. He told me he had a degree from the University of Connecticut in communications. I knew that he had worked on a radio station upstate, and I could have contacted the university to find out if he had that degree, but I took his word for it. Who lies about that? Well, I found out years later I should have checked it out, because he never attended that school and he didn't have a degree. Little things got by me. A distinct one-letter change in the name of somebody who had signed a document twice. Who misspells their own name, even though it was the word Lee, L-E-E, and then it looked like L-E-A. Larry was not a good speller, but these things they kind of got by me on a certain way. And the best thing that ever happened to him regarding me was on our very first trip to the United Kingdom. And you know this because you're familiar with the book. Something happened to me that, again, like my childhood event, completely changed my life, which was on our first night of our first visit to the area where this had happened to him, allegedly, we had a UFO event. I mean, it was major and involved small, kind of zigzagging, star-sized UFOs in the sky, full disc-shaped ones hanging over the forest, something that went into the forest and lit it up like a whole city was back there, but it was just a forest. I got really anxious. And we audio taped this whole thing. You have read the transcription, but he actually apologized to me. He said, I thought something might happen while we were here. I didn't realize it was going to be this big. I actually backed off for some months after that because it really freaked me out. And again, it was the best thing that could have happened for him, because after that, I basically said, okay, you're either going to believe this guy or you're not going to believe this guy. And I decided whatever he says, I will accept. And if there's a problem, it's because he has post-traumatic stress disorder or drinking problem or whatever, but he's a really heroic character. And for years, that was my attitude. I went about my own research. I incorporated his testimony into our manuscript. We worked on it for many years. The book was published. Took 9 years to write. And in that time, we both returned to England together and on our own a number of times. Nobody's paying for this, we're spending our own money and that kind of thing. And ultimately, the book is published in America. It does okay, no worse than most UFO books. But in England, it went through the ceiling. In the United Kingdom, it was a best-selling book. And there's no other way to say it. We both became very well known there, actually recognized on the streets. We were in the papers a lot, on BBC, on different television shows. And from then, for years, we'd go back and speak at conferences, made friendships. And it was years before his story started to unravel. And when it did, this is about 5 or 6 years ago, my first reaction was no. Everybody's making a mistake. What was happening was independent researchers were writing to me or sending me emails saying, with respect, you are wrong about this. I checked this and it's not what he said. Or he said this in this year, and then he said something completely different in that year, and then he said something completely different here. And I got more and more arrogant, really, of just, please don't tell me I know better than anybody. And then I started to actually read what these people were researching and finding. And I realized, holy shit, I have made a bunch of errors. And I believed him on things I should not have. And on certain things I dug, but I should have dug deeper. And then when I realized what had happened, and that all of these independent researchers in the UK who had done such a good job of correcting my errors, that our book was a problem. It was supposed to be a nonfiction book, but there was a lot of fiction in it. And so with very mixed feelings, I went to our publisher in New York and I explained what I had found and said, you and your people need to look at all the evidence I have. And if you come to the same conclusion that I do, I am sorry to say, you need to take this book out of print, because it is not what you thought it was or what I thought it was. And they did their own investigation and they suspended publication of the book, which again, you work on something for so long and you take such pride in it and you watch it be brought down and it's the right thing. And then I spent a year, 2 years, basically in one way or another, trying to correct my errors on radio shows, television shows, things I was writing, conversations I was having. and went into quite a depression. And it was very difficult for me to get out of it. It took several years before I really kind of refound myself. But I was fooled, and I was very well fooled. But he also, with my help, fooled Bud Hopkins and Nick Pope and John Mack and David Jacobs and Graham Birdsall and Nick Pope and Philip Mantle, and so on down the pantheon of well-known and respected ufologists, Timothy Good. So I had to kind of really, really take stock of myself again. And when this happens, and I hope it doesn't happen to other people, but when it does, what you shouldn't do is ignore it or make believe it will go away or try to be a tough guy and just say, people will forget after a while, but I'm not going to admit I was wrong even when I know I was wrong, because I don't like to admit I'm wrong. You need to correct these things. And in doing so, after several years, I realized something had happened that really surprised me in a way. I regained the respect of people whose respect I had lost. And other people who had followed this whole story came back in a way that was very supportive of me. And that support allowed me to kind of forgive myself and get back to work. There's a lot of other cases to deal with. But since then, although Rendlesham was real, it was important. Whatever happens there needs to be studied. There are credible witnesses. There are terrific researchers, but I completely burned out on it. And it is the one case I have kind of organically developed no interest in following. It's not even that it's too painful. It's just I am burned out on it. I wish everybody involved well. And a number of books on the subject have come out since Left at East Gate by witnesses, by researchers. The last one I read was the one by Nick Pope and John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. Nick, of course, well-known ufologist. Jim and John, real witnesses, not like Larry, who I am convinced created his part in this and did a very good job of doing that, and convinced a lot of people that he was involved in an event that I don't think happened, the alleged event on the third night. So I will always be proud of many parts of Left at East Gate. For example, there are several hundred footnotes that have been fact-checked and annotated. There's a great deal of background information on the area, on the forest, on the Air Force's presence there, the United States Air Force's presence, and on other witness accounts. Nobody can take those things away from me, and more important, nobody can take the value of those things away from people interested in the story. But for anybody who has the book or wants to read the book, do it with caution. You must understand that I never met anybody better in my life at not telling the truth and doing it with tremendous passion and commitment and making you think that he was telling the truth. So if you read the book, his personal account, there's plenty in there that's true, but there's plenty in there that's not. I cannot tell you what to separate from what, though. So read it as a cautionary tale and do it with a critical eye.
Oh, I'm very proud of you because you have the humble to, well, I made a mistake and try to correct it. I'm very proud of you.
Ever?
You know that. But let's talk something good. You are the associate producer of the award-winning documentary Travis: The True Story of Travis Walton. I know Travis as well. I'm trying to contact him. Please help me.
I will.
And but anyway, many people still doubt. And a couple, a few months ago, a few a time ago, people are trying to uh, tell that the whole story was fabricated.
That's right.
And including one of his friends that in the past said, "Oh, he was a bit well, he wasn't a part of the scene of the abduction of the UFO in the light."
That's right.
What do you think about these people that still not believe in travels, and how travels? You are his friend. How travels deal with this eternal doubt, eternal distrust about his case?
Well, for starters, anyone listening must know, as Thiago has just said, I am his friend. So you can say, Peter is going to say something that will be supportive, of course. Well, if he's lying, then yet again, I am the victim of a liar, and that makes me look bad. I first heard about Travis Walton really not long after I got involved in the subject in the 1970s, and his book, which came out originally under the title The Travis Walton Experience, and then was republished some years later as Fire in the Sky, and of course made into a Hollywood movie with that name as well. I was very impressed with the book, and we first met about 1990 when we spoke at the same conference. At that time, I also met Mike Rogers. Mike was his good friend from childhood on. They worked on the same logging crew, and it was Mike who was driving the truck that night and, took off when Travis got hit by this beam of light from this UFO. We went on to become friends and then good friends. And ultimately, my friend Jennifer Stein, a American filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, approached me, and I brought them together. She had not met Travis, but she felt his story warranted a really quality documentary. And she and her co-producer, Bob Terrio, spent 5 years and a great deal of money putting together what I think is one of the best UFO documentaries, and also just a terrific documentary. Forget about UFOs. You know it, you've seen it, you can attest to it. In fact, it was screened on Saturday at an all-day conference online called the Skyfire conference, which marked the 46th anniversary last week of Travis's abduction. Why do people attack credible witnesses whose stories have been backed up by the testimony of others, their testimony backed up by lie detection tests, voice stress analysis, hypnotic regression, scientific analysis of changes in the organic material in the area where it happened, how the lines in the tree trunk right there at the original site where I have visited in the Sitgrave National Forest, on the side that was facing away from where this beam hit Travis, the tree line growth is normal. On the side where the tree faced what was some kind of radiation, they are at least twice as large, and the tree evolved to grow out in that direction. Plus, in that concentrated little area of forest, the acceleration of growth of the trees was so noticeable that the only thing that they could find in the scientific literature to compare it to was tree growth in the area of Chernobyl after the nuclear plant melted down and accelerated the growth of the plants that, obviously didn't die, but just got a ferocious blast and grew even stronger. We have also the testimony of former FBI profiler talking about the odds of that many men faking a story and sticking to it. So what happened earlier this year that you're referring to, Thiago, I think it involved three people. One, a woman who runs a website in Australia that is a debunker website, dedicated to a dismissing of the UFO phenomena. This woman claims that, for example, the Betty and Barney Hill case, they weren't abducted by aliens. Somehow they created that story, but what they really saw was a light on a tower several miles away. And that insulting explanation is supposed to explain their abduction experience. What this woman did was take the story created by somebody who was an alleged filmmaker, I think looking for attention more than anything, and then a third person who kind of joined them, and they developed this whole theory around, on that night, Travis and Mike had decided to fake Travis's UFO abduction to get money from a famous American tabloid newspaper. And the way they were going to do it was there was a fire tower. You know, they were in a huge national forest, and they were going to get a third person who's never been identified to go up into that tower. He would have had to have gone up with a very heavy, very powerful light, and at just the right moment, shine that light into that clearing and create a light in that clearing that somebody with very little brain cells would say, oh my goodness, a fully articulated disc-shaped craft shooting a beam of light at a man and watching him go 3 meters, jumping, just flying back. Well, one of the first things that was established after they had had airtime and were starting to become people who were known was that the light that all this was based on, the fire tower all this was based on, was almost 4 miles away. Number one. Number two, the light would have had to bend to go over a ridge of trees several miles away. Number three, how would they know the exact moment to shine the light? Nobody had a cell phone in 1975, and there was no way to communicate, and so on. It was ludicrous. It was actually, it'd be funny if it wasn't so insulting. But then other people, armchair researchers online, I never believed that story. I always wondered, he got all this attention, and all of a sudden, it's a story. I have a dark sense of humor, but I sometimes joke with people that if you want to become famous in America, all you need to do is shoot somebody really famous, and then you're famous. It's easy and it's quick. Well, you can shoot somebody with a gun, or you can shoot them allegorically. And one moment you're a nobody, the next moment you're being invited to speak on radio shows and give your opinion of this. And I think that is exactly what happened. Also, Mike and Travis had a number of arguments over the years. And this kind of came to the fore also. I think Mike felt Travis got all the attention, but he and the other men suffered as well. And that wasn't fair, that all the attention was on him. Well, they didn't write a book. He did. And he was the one who was taken. So there is that. But Mike then said it didn't happen. And then several months later said, I apologize, it did happen. So that didn't help things either. For your viewers, I would suggest, I think it's on Amazon, I'm not sure, but if you search for the title, it's Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton. It is a very scientific, very analytical, very well-made documentary, which I think for most reasonable people will lay out his account in such a way that you cannot go away thinking they made it up. Please.
I agree. I watched the documentary. It's amazing. It's amazing. I know Travis. We were in 2 or 3 congress here in Brazil.
Yeah.
He never got rich. He lost family. He lost jobs. He lost a lot of things that not worth to lie, something like that.
Yep.
And if he it was made up in the beginning, and I will get rich. 5, 6, 10 years later, I didn't get rich, so let's stop it. But he always say the same thing. He never changed it. He never got. Of course, they got money because the royalties, something like that, but never got rich. And I think, in my opinion, he lost much more
Yeah.
that he got.
You are open to ridicule. There are people that will make fun of you behind your back. There will people that think that you're some kind of freak or liar or con person, con man, when in reality, you're just a human being who has walked into a moment in time where something extraordinary has happened to you. For me, over the years, I have tried to put myself behind the eyes in the position of skeptics and why sometimes they react so violently to these cases. And I think a lot of it comes down to, and very understandably so, their own anxiety that if this is true, like the experience I had as a kid, if this is true, then everything I thought I knew is now open to question. And everybody that I've ever made fun of that alleged to have had this experience, oh my God, maybe they were right. And I was just ignorant and reacting from a defensive kind of point of view because I can't really let myself believe that this is true. And that brings up another question, the idea of belief. People have said to me, do you believe, aliens are abducting people? Well, I have to respond because I've been in a privileged position in a way of years of spending time with these people, of seeing the implants that have come out of them, of seeing them in places that there's no way they could have naturally gotten to, in x-rays, in CAT scans, of seeing the analysis of organic material that was touched or affected by contact with a truly anomalous UFO or intelligence, declassified documents, multiple witnesses, family members, where I've met with certain people where there are 3 generations in the same family, a mother, a daughter, a grandmother, who all have the same memories of these things happening to them. And in a few cases, the same kind of scar in the same location on the same leg. I don't have the luxury of disbelief. So when somebody says, do you believe personally that these things are happening? I don't mean to be sarcastic, but I might respond by no more or no less than I believe I'm sitting in a chair. Belief doesn't have anything to do with it.
That's great, my friend. To end our interview, we could spend 1,000 of hours talking about UFOs. Tell us about your plans, about your talk show, your program on YouTube. Tell us. And it's in English, okay, but YouTube has a tool that can put some subtitles in Portuguese, and the translation is very good. So no excuse, please.
Well, almost 2 years ago, I was asked by the American radio station KGRA, whose founder was an old friend of mine, if I wanted to host a radio show. And my first thought was I was flattered. That's a compliment. My second thought was, oh God, do I need the extra work? You don't get paid for this. There are so many good people out there doing podcasts and radio broadcasts on this subject. Do we need another one? Even if I could do it well, and I thought I could, but at the same time, I knew I was looking for a way to reach beyond the audience that you and I, Thiago, always reach. And they are the people that are watching right now. They are the people that are interested in the subject, that follow it, that read the books, that go to the conferences, that listen to the shows, that watch the documentaries, that talk about it, that go online to learn more. Or, how do we get beyond them to the larger population? I know in Brazil, this subject is taken very seriously by many people, but many more people do not. Same as the United States, although the government's attitude, I think, historically has been better than the American government's attitude. And I thought doing a radio show would be a way to develop a wider audience. But how do I reach the audience of people who have never watched a UFO radio show or podcast or could care less about it, and still hold the audience of the people who listen to In America Coast to Coast or in Brazil watch your show? And I thought about it for several months. And I ultimately, from the time I was asked to when I started, almost a year passed, because I really wanted to get this clear in my mind. And by the time I started, I had it clear. And the show is called Meanwhile, Here on Earth. And there are two basic things that happen. One is I bring on somebody who is known and respected and contributed to the UFO field, or maybe paranormal research. For example, somebody like the host of this show. And rather than say, oh, tell us about what you think about the Tic Tac case or the latest news on, what's going on in your country, or where can people see you next, I begin one way or the other by saying, we know who you are, unless we are new to the subject. And of course, we don't know who you are. But the rest of us know who you are. We have read your books. We have seen you at conferences. We have watched you in documentaries, but we really don't know who you are. I am curious about how you became the person and the professional that many of us look up to and admire and respect. And then we have an opportunity for them to tell the story of their life, quite simply, from their childhood, through their schoolwork, the books that inspired them, the movies, the individual people who either stood in their way or helped them, where they really first became interested. Are they somebody who's had an experience, or did they just intellectually get interested? Talk about the family, tragedies you've been through, triumphs that you have had, and make yourself into a human being for us. Therefore, if I've already read your books or know who you are, now I have a really better idea of who you are. And it reinforces, hopefully, that I want to see your next book, or I can now identify with you in some way, or at least respect how you became who you are. And again, if you're new to the subject, I think that's a better way to meet somebody than to just, you're watching this person who's famous for other people, but not for you, and going, I feel a little outside this, this is not my thing. But now we all learn about them together. So that is working. And almost everybody I've approached with this idea, with the exception of literally one person who was concerned about their memory starting to fail them, older person. Literally everybody has said, you know what? I would like to do that because nobody has ever asked me to do that kind of interview. The other thing that I'm doing is putting together panel discussions of different people talking together about different subjects. I had a panel some months ago, all women. I'm very proud of that. All women UFO abductee experiencers and mothers who were in one way or another professionals in the work. I did a panel discussion 2 weeks ago about the nuclear UFO incursions that have been happening for decades over different nuclear missile bases around the world with Stephen Bassett, the one person in Washington, D.C., who is a full-time lobbyist against UFO secrecy for disclosure, with Lee Spiegel, a very distinguished journalist who for many years just covered UFO-related stories and paranormal stories for the well-known American news organization, the Huffington Post, and Daniel Sheehan, who has a history as a civil liberties and civil rights attorney, but who became involved in the UFO cover-up when Carter was president. And we discussed the press conference that Stephen and I and Danny attended that was put on by our friend Robert Salas, who, when I had the privilege of speaking in Brazil, he also was speaking at the same conference. And Robert, as we know, when he was an Air Force officer in charge of 10 nuclear missiles, all targeted for the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, a big, truly anomalous disc-shaped object came in over the base, and it shut down all of his nuclear missiles. So panel discussions also in August on the 10th anniversary of Bud Hopkins' death, people who had worked with him because they were abductees, people who were my colleagues who worked with him either as mental health professionals or helped around the office, people who were members of the Intruders Foundation board. And the last 45 minutes of the show was very special for me, and I think many of our viewers, because it was just a conversation with his only child, his daughter, Grace Hopkins, who is a very fine photographer and basically working to allow more and more people to learn about Bud Hopkins, the artist, the painter. And I found that very moving because as a painter and somebody who worked with Bud, not just on his UFO stuff, but in the studio, we should know about this. Also, to remember that for many of us in this work, we are not just this one-dimensional creature that lives, eats, and breathes UFOs. We have families or different passions and different interests. I am a photographer. I love to travel. I worked in the New York art world for many years. I worked in the theater, in management off Broadway for many years. I am a passionate student of the world of film. And I think it is healthy to know these things about people who, yes, they distinguish themselves in the UFO field, but in reality, there is a lot more to them. And I have valued everything I have learned about people in that respect.
Well, my friend, thank you very much. I watch all the episodes of your show. If I miss some, I back. I go another day. I watch it because it's amazing, and there's no problem to understand English. Just translate it on YouTube.
That's great. I
Thank.
will add, to jump in for one moment, on YouTube, there are about 35 of my programs. Again, Meanwhile Here on Earth, and you can find them. But then they stop, and they are now going on a service called Spreaker, like the word speaker, but SPREAKER.com. You can find them there, and you can also watch them live at no cost by going to the radio station URL, KGRA DB for digital broadcasting, KGRADB.com. Eastern Standard Time, it is 7 to 9. So that is 5 to 7 your time?
We are 2 hours
later?
ahead of you. I'm 2
Yeah.
hours ahead of you.
So yes, for me, if it's 7 to 9, for you, it's 5 to 7. And then it's there for another 24 hours, maybe 30 hours. Also, it is on YouTube for free for one day after, and then they take it off. But do watch. I would love to have you in my audience, and I hope at some point in the not too distant future, we will have back this gentleman, either on a panel or on his own. This is like a brother to me, and I am honored to have been a guest on your show.
Thank you, my friend. I will leave all the links of your show in your Facebook in the description of this interview. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, my brother.
My pleasure.
Então, gostaram da entrevista? Você só encontra aqui no canal, não adianta. Peter falou muita coisa, coisas inéditas para o nosso público brasileiro. Ele que esteve durante muito tempo ao lado de Butch Hopkins, aprendeu bastante sobre como tratar uma abdução extraterrestre, como tratar as pessoas, os abduzidos por seres extraterrestres. E também, como disse, o Peter esteve envolvido nessa trama do caso de Woodbridge, Bentwaters ou Hedishman, na Inglaterra. Espero que vocês tenham gostado de mais essa entrevista. Deixe a sua opinião nos comentários. Um abraço e até o próximo vídeo.